So coming up on April 16th, Jordanis Ugas and Errol Spence Jr. will be fighting in a partial unification title match in the welterweight division. Now, this is a fight that ordinarily I wouldn't comment on, and I was hesitant to make this video, but I've been giving it some more thought over the last week or two, and it's a more intriguing and more competitive and potentially difficult to predict matchup than I had originally thought. Now, Jordanis Ugas is a name that only relatively recently became well known to boxing fans, of course, because of his upset victory over Manny Pacquiao in August of last year. Ugas really came into my radar after his fight with Shawn Porter, because like a lot of boxing fans, I actually thought that Ugas did more than enough to earn the decision over Shawn Porter, and he was, quote, robbed of a decision. Ugas is a very efficient, technically sound boxer puncher with an emphasis on the word boxer. He is very refined. He has a refined amateur background. He was a Olympic bronze medalist in 2008. And he fights with just a very sound, kind of straight up boxing style. Very strong jab, good tight defense, strong right hand. Doesn't do any one thing overwhelmingly well, but he just has a very tight, sound game. And it was this technically proficient boxing punching style that enabled him to really diffuse Manny Pacquiao's kind of whirlwind style and his hand speed and his combination punching. Errol Spence is someone for whom I have some concerns, not necessarily health concern, but he had that horrible car accident in late 2019. This fight with Ugas will only be his second fight in 2.5 years. And in the modern era of boxing, where you have all these managerial and promotional conflicts, different promotional companies have a hard time negotiating with each other. It's not that unusual for an elite fighter to have that level of inactivity. But if you're an old school boxing fan like I am, I've been following boxing since the early 1980s. Back in the day, one fight in 2.5 years for any elite boxer was absolutely unheard of. I remember before Sugar Ray Leonard fought Marvin Hagler, he had been off for the better part of 3 years, and people thought that it was an impossible task for Leonard, even though he was only 30 years old. But for Errol Spence, this actually, to me, is a source of a genuine wild card. It could be some real concern because even though Errol Spence is an absolute workhorse in the gym when he's preparing for a fight, he is seemingly one of these guys who does let himself go when he's not in training camp. He has been known to blow up in weight. And after the car accident, he got all the way up to 192 pounds. So with Spence, there are these unknown factors. Another thing I take into consideration, Errol is now 31 years old. Now, in the modern era of boxing, that is not old at all, but he has been struggling to get down to 147 pounds for as long as I can remember. This is a guy who is completely ripped in the gym at over 160. So I'm always waiting, and I've been waiting for the last 3 years when Errol will get into the ring and be sort of starched, drained, and won't be able to rehydrate and compensate for the sacrifice he's made, making 147. So I think that the template to beat Errol Spence, it's possible that it just doesn't exist for any welterweight. Errol is, in my opinion, in terms of talent, an all-time great welterweight. He has this abnormally big welterweight frame. He is a technically brilliant boxer. Errol's defense, I think, is one of his most underrated strengths. He doesn't use a lot of exaggerated upper body movement or a lot of foot movement to avoid punches, but he has just a very tight, sound defense where he relies on blocking and parrying punches. He brings his fists back to position to block immediately after he punches. And so the way to get around that, I think, was exploited by Sean Porter. Sean Porter would throw three, four, five punches, maybe only one would get through, and then he'd throw a sixth punch, a seventh punch, an eighth punch. That's not Yordenis Ugas's style. He moves forward with a very simple kind of jab, right hand, sometimes mixing it up with the left hook. But he also, like Errol Spence, fights in kind of a very tight shell, and he only lets his hands go when he knows he's not going to be immediately countered. So my initial thoughts on this fight were this is clearly going to be a relatively tightly contested fight, but Spence will have the advantage because, unlike Ugas, Spence is equally comfortable, in my opinion, going forward and moving to the side. And he just has a greater variety, throws a greater variety of punches. Ugas pretty much is limited to the jab, right hand, the uppercut. But I just feel that because of Ugas's overall quality, his caliber as an athlete, with his amateur background as a pro, I don't feel he's been legitimately beaten. So there are enough wild cards that I actually do view this as a pick'em fight. It is a virtually even fight. So my formal prediction is I do have to go with Spence by a narrow victory. On the scorecards, it would read 115, 113, maybe as much as 116, 112. A draw would not surprise me, but that's my take on the fight. There's a lot more that could be said, but if you'd like to offer your own thoughts, leave a comment in the comment section.